Hi, and welcome to Thank You, Mama. I'm your host, Anna Teider, and I would like to explain to you why we have a little bit of a longer episode today. Today, we have a very, very special guest from whom we learn a lot. My guest today is Susan Moylan-Coombs. Susan is a First Nations woman from Australia. She's a speaker and an advocate for social justice. And Susan was a part of the stolen generation in Australia of the First Nation children who were taken away from their families. So today we will not only learn very deep lessons from Susan's both mothers, her biological mother and her adoptive mother, but we will learn about Australian history, about its First Nations, about the stolen generation, and also about dealing with racism and how to save the planet. So welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. So my name's Susan, and I'm a Gurindji Wurrunga woman. I'm a First Nations woman in Australia, and a lot of the work that I do today is about empowerment and healing, and I do that through the work of social justice and advocacy for our rights as First Nations people here in Australia. And if people know about the history of Australia, that for us as First Nations people, we are the oldest living surviving culture on the planet.
I just learned that through you, Susan, and I'm very excited to talk to you because I consider myself not badly educated, but I'm learning as I go, and I'm so excited to learn more. Yes, tell us.
and I think that's been a part of the fact that the way that this country that we now call Australia, that it's been home to us as First Nations people for, some would say, 120,000 years. So we've been here for a long time. When the British invaded, colonized our land, and we had various people like Captain Cook and others that came later and set up the so-called penal colony here in Sydney. That was to the detriment of us as First Nations people. So we've had a history of basically trying to cover up and rewrite those early settlement years and that narrative. So, we were seen as savages, we were seen in a certain light. And when you understand history and the fact that it's been written by the point of view of the conqueror, we as First Nations people were not written, spoken about, or portrayed in a positive light. So it allowed a particular consciousness to invade and to grow, and the way that we are perceived today is one where we're still healing through the trauma of that history, and we're trying to assert our rights as sovereign people, and we're trying to really explore and explain that shared history that we have here in Australia, and to educate non-Indigenous people and the newcomers that come and settle in Australia as well. So they're not necessarily told the truth. So there's a big movement happening in Australia with First Nations people about truth and treaty and sovereignty. So it's a bit of a global movement, right?
Yes, but Susan, what I've learned is that right now, 3.3% of
So
population.
prior to 1788, we were 100% of the population. So we were nations, and the thing that I say is think of the continent of Europe. Think of all of those different countries, nations, languages, cultural practices, spiritual beliefs. That's exactly what traditional society looked like for us as First Nations people here. So from the East Coast to the West Coast, very different culture, very different language.
That was so amazing for me to learn, Susan, that I read that there are 145 different languages. How amazing is that?
Yeah, so it's about how we can reveal and uncover those truths, and that Australia, for such a long time was seen as a Western Anglo nation. Then we became a very multicultural nation, and all along, we as the First Nations people, the original people, have just been here trying to survive through all the trauma of government policies that literally just tried to wipe us out. So it's revealing those truths that more and more non-Indigenous people are starting to understand and starting to be taught in our education system. Our media outlets, some of them are really trying to present a more balanced view of who we are as a part of this population. And yes, you're correct that today we make up only 3% of the population. So it's difficult to continue to present an argument about the way this country was supposedly settled, but more that it was invaded and our lands were taken and stolen from us. And then subsequently all of the dispossession and the massacres and the policies of removing children, which is called the stolen generations.
Which we're going to talk about. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, this is why I'm very happy you're here and you have a voice, and I'm very glad to meet you. So, Susan, you are a part of that stolen generation.
Yeah. So for a long period of our shared history, so from 1788 onwards, there had been the practices of removing children from their parents. And it was happening right back in the early days of so-called settlement or colonization. It became quite an extensive period right up to the late 60s, the 1960s in this country, where children were removed. It was a government policy. It was deemed that these half-caste children, so children that were born of mixed race, and then also, these are terms around quantity of people's ancestry, which is deemed to be politically incorrect. But when both parents were First Nations, and that term full blood, which was used quite extensively, and also half caste, and so all of these kind of quantitative measurements of one's cultural mix. So I was born in 1964. The policy of removing children was still happening in this
Mm.
country.
Will you tell us what was the point of this policy? That sounds so
So,
incredibly
yeah.
barbaric to me that I'm just, yeah.
So it happened to many nations around the world. So it was to basically breed us out. It was
Yeah.
basically to make
Yeah.
us white and to assimilate us into a culture that was ours. And so the word assimilate, but also genocide. And when you look at the United Nations definition of acts of genocide, that when you remove children from their parents with the intention of breeding out their culture, then that is genocide. So I know that this is true for the Canadian First Nations people and the Native American people. That it was to basically breed us out and kill us off.
Mm.
And the thing for us is that we survived it, and it's not without its trauma. But in my case, I was removed from my parents in 64, and
How old were
both
you, Susan?
I was taken at birth.
Oh, okay.
So
Mm.
both my parents were removed as well. So my father came from Wave Hill, Kalkarinji. My mother came from up around Darwin in the Northern Territory. They were both taken from their parents to a mission on a place called Melville Island. There's two islands off the coast of Darwin, and there was a Catholic mission called Garden Point Mission on Melville Island. So they were sent there. I was conceived. When I was born in Darwin Hospital, because of the policy, I was removed from my mother. And I spent a period of time in the hospital, a period of time in an orphanage, and they wanted to separate me from my parents. So because my parents were in their mid-teens, 15, 16, when I was born, and they were on the mission, they were sent away. So typically the young girl becomes a domestic servant, slave to people, to families. And then my father became a labourer. So they were sent away. I was then transferred across to Garden Point Mission, and I was there from 6 months of age up until about 3. So what was going on in Australia at that time was a lot of the social rights movement, and we had people kind of wanting to be recognised for our rights as sovereign people. We have a constitution in this country that was put in place back in 1901, where we were simply written out of the constitution. And 67, we had a referendum, which was about the Australian population giving the powers to the Commonwealth of Australia to create laws for and about who we were as First Nations people. So it was the largest yes vote that an Australian referendum has ever seen, and we've never seen one since. And basically all of the institutions were closed down, and there was a call out to Australian families, so white families, to take in or adopt Aboriginal children, First Nations children. So I ended up being adopted and becoming Susan Coombs. My birth name was Susan Calmer. And on my birth certificate now, because I was adopted into a family on Sydney's Northern Beaches, my birth certificate now says John and Jan Coombs, and I became Susan Coombs at the age of 3. So grew up on the Northern Beaches. It was a traumatizing thing to be removed. It was a traumatizing thing to be flown to Sydney and placed into a white family. And for a long time, I just didn't understand what was going on. And I didn't understand why I was black and my 3 sisters were white. And in Harbord, which is a suburb on the Northern Beaches, I didn't see myself in other people. I was in a typically, middle class Western suburb, and I didn't look like anybody else. So it was a period of my life where I grew up not understanding what was going on. And I grew up thinking like I didn't really belong in this family because I don't look like them. And they were very loving and caring and inclusive of me. And I just was like, I'm black and they're not. What's going on? So I laugh about it because that's just the way that I have to stay buoyant with it. But I lost my culture. I lost my birthright to be with my mother and father. I lost my language. I lost my connection to country, and I was flown out of one state into another state, and I was just in this environment that was completely foreign to me. So it caused a lot of issues for me growing up. I was, called a lot of things when I was at school, and they weren't pleasant or nice things, and I had to really, go through bullying and racial comments and taunts and things like that. But I guess the thing that saved me was that I had 3 sisters. I had a loving family in Sydney. I was also very athletic, so I used to represent the school in swimming and running and cross country and a lot of different sporting activities. And I ended up being the school captain in primary school. So there were things that started to kind of counteract the racial discrimination that I was experiencing, and people started to see me in a different light. But there was still the underlying trauma of a child that had been removed at birth, sent to a mission, was there for 3 years, sent to another state, adopted into a non Indigenous family, and then raised in a very middle class way. So a lot of who I am is shaped by those early experiences, knowing that I was Indigenous, knowing that I was different. And even to a certain extent, um, I knew things that now as an adult that I can see were innate cultural characteristics, but I didn't understand it at the time. And so it wasn't until much later when I had more exposure to elders and teachers that I was able to culturally understand who I was and have this ability to find the balance for myself and walk between two worlds and be able to do the work that I do.
Susan, let's talk about your mom and moms, because
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah. So I the thing that I say is that I have two mums and I have two families. And for me it was about always trying to find the silver lining in my life experience because it was so traumatic that I could have drowned in all of that experience or I could do something different. So when I was, I guess, old enough to have an awareness and an understanding about what had happened to me, um, there was really, beautiful family memories of being Susan Coombs. I had no memory because I was younger than 3 of being Susan
Yeah.
Calmer and what it was like to
Yeah.
be on the mission. So,
Yeah.
Jan Coombs was, and she's passed now, but
Mm-hmm.
she's someone that yes, she was my mum and she raised me. She also was like my friend. We
Mm-hmm.
we got on really well together, and my relationship with her was very different to her birth children. So I have 3 sisters, and they're biological children to John and Jan Coombs, and I had a really beautiful relationship with her, and I learnt a lot from her. And she was very supportive of me when I wanted to trace my biological mother. So in my teens, mid-teens, when I was around 16, 17, my adopted grandfather, Dr. H.C. Coombs, who was a prominent public servant in Australia, he said to me, because he did a lot of work in and around Indigenous affairs, he said that if I wanted to meet my biological parents, that he would, support me to do that. And I felt at the time in my teens that emotionally I wasn't ready. And I went back to him in my early 20s and I said, you know what? I think I'd like to try now and see if we can, meet my mum. So he helped me and I was able to make contact with my mother, Maxine, in Darwin. And one of the things that I said to her when I finally spoke to her on the phone, through all the tears, was that I wanted to come to Sydney. I wanted to come to Darwin to meet her, and I also wanted to bring my Sydney mum Jan, because as a young woman, here were 2 women that I called mum, and one gave birth to me, and the other one raised me. So for my emotional kind of sense of well-being, I needed to see both of them at the same time. And
Did
look,
you do
lucky
it?
for me, yeah. Lucky for me, they both liked each other. And
Yeah.
when the 3 of us all met up, like it was really beautiful. And they established a relationship. I established a relationship with my biological mother Maxine, and I still have a relationship with her and her husband and my three half brothers, or four half brothers, because one of them's in Adelaide now. He was adopted out as well. So I was adopted, and I was the eldest of Maxine's children, and then she had another son who was adopted out, and then she married and had three boys up in Darwin. So it's been an interesting journey, and making those connections back with my cultural roots, my ancestry, so to speak, and seeing myself so much in Maxine, because I'm biologically her daughter,
Yes.
so we look incredibly alike, which I love. And the more that I spent time up in Darwin with family like aunties and uncles, they would stare at me and say, "Oh, you look so much like your mother when she was your age." So
That's beautiful.
Really beautiful. So, like, I have that connection with her, and I love the fact that both Jan and Maxine had a really beautiful connection as well. So here were two women from very different life experiences, and trauma for Maxine, and a different life in Sydney for Jan, and that wasn't easy for her either. But trying to do the best to raise four girls in Sydney, and allowing me the time and space to look at my ancestry and what that meant for me, and constantly trying to, she would be really good in terms of having conversations with me all the way through my life, because of the things that I experienced as an Indigenous person in a very white suburbia kind of suburb. So I learned lots of things from them both.
I just wanted to ask you, can you share some lessons from your two mums with us?
Yeah. So one of the things that, for Jan, I used to come home from school a lot just being so upset from being bullied, and people making nasty comments about who I was and my racial background. And I used to go home in tears all the time. And I remember Jan saying to me one time, it's actually not about you, it's about them. And she said, children in the playground are not bad. They just learn bad stuff from their family. And what they're representing is more about them than it is about you. She kept saying, you're a good person. You're a nice person. And you don't deserve that treatment. You don't deserve to be discriminated in that way. But ultimately, it speaks about them and their bad behavior and the way that they treat others, and that I was a good person. So, as a child, when you're emotionally raw and people are being mean to you in the playground or in the classroom, even out in the suburbs, that I got to, it took a while, but I got to understand what she meant by that. And it allowed me to reframe the way that I held myself. And it just, I got to the point where I'm like, you know what? I am a good person. I don't deserve that. And I was able to have conversations with people that they either got it or they didn't. And if they didn't understand what I was saying, then not my problem. So I could say to them, that's not very nice. I don't like being called that. And, as you do as a child in that language and frame. But I ended up, with a response to situations where I would keep myself in check. What is it that I've just done? How is it that this person has seen something and said something that is not correct or not nice or not the right thing to do? How do I hold myself in this situation? How do I understand what the dynamic of this situation is? What is my role? And if if there is an innocence in who I am and people are responding to the color of my skin, that's more about them than it is about me. So I always I kept thinking, there's a level of arrogance in the way that I now hold myself, because it's not my stuff. If people are racist, if people are just not nice people, it's not my stuff. So I guess have created a protective shield, and I hold myself within that. And if I've responded in a way that has given rise to someone's bad behavior, then I will address that for me with them. If they're just responding really badly to me because of their racist attitudes, that's their stuff, and I won't cop it, or I won't take that on board.
But this is such an important lesson also for people,
Yeah.
for everybody. This is such an
Yep.
important lesson for everybody in a marriage, in uh,
In
whatever
any relationship.
situation. Yes, in any relationship, to
Yeah.
not internalize, to not blame yourself, and to realize that very often, if not always, people's actions and reactions, as you say, talk about them and not about
Yeah.
you. It would make our lives so much easier and less painful. I
Yeah.
think, especially for women, if we
Yeah.
learned to understand it's not about us. Thank
Yeah.
you for sharing
And
that.
and it's such a hard one, that for someone like me, like I learnt it really young in primary school, and have seen the way that it shaped me and my responses to different situations. So,
Mm,
you're right. That dynamic, and having that self-awareness, and the ability to self-reflect in
mhm,
situations. So whether it's about the relationship dynamic in a workplace, or a relationship
mhm,
dynamic in a marriage, or within a family with siblings, or as a parent and child, or a child to parent, that it's how we conduct ourselves, and
mm,
how we can have healthy relationships and healthy, you know, dialogue, narratives, but also actions that we take as well.
yes,
So
yes.
how do we hold ourselves? How do we conduct ourselves? How do we speak to people?
Mm,
That's done with the level of integrity. And if others treat you badly, then have the strength to see it for what it is, from where it's coming from, and
yes,
present your
yeah.
case, and choose those situations and arguments wisely, and also realize sometimes it's just best to walk away.
Yeah. And as I've just learned in theory, I haven't really internalized it yet, to act and not to react.
Yeah.
I'm very passionate creation who loves to react, and I have to learn to act. So this
Yeah.
is, yeah.
And look, it is about understanding what is the appropriate behavior given the situation.
Mm,
And if the situation requires you to react, so maybe there's a car coming straight for you, and the appropriate reaction is to get out of the way. So you have to react to the situation. If the situation dynamic is someone is racially vilifying you, and
mm,
doing things within a workplace, there's meant to be laws and legislation that protect people's cultural identity. But then there's also just people's bad behavior, and
mm,
and how do you respond that cares for self, but also cares for the other people, but understands the other person. So just because someone's hitting you over the head doesn't mean you should hit them back.
mm,
Protect yourself, and if there is a case to reason, or if there's a case to just get out of the way, and remove yourself from the situation, you have to have the ability to understand the dynamic of what's going on, and then
mm,
act appropriately.
mm, mm.
Otherwise, it's just this kind of craziness that we get into,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
people hurt each other because someone's hurt
yeah,
me,
yeah,
and is that a good excuse to do that?
yeah. Susan, do we have more
So
lessons from your
yeah,
mom?
In terms of Maxine, so my biological mother up in Darwin, I guess the lessons that I learnt from her were when I got to meet her again in my 20s, that there was this beautiful woman that had been through so much trauma. And for her, she was removed from her parents. Then, she was pregnant with me. And when I was born, I was removed at birth. So here was a lady who walked with incredible trauma and pain, and the grace and the beauty and the loving woman that she was, and the caring woman that she was. She didn't allow all of that trauma to change her behavior. And I just remember sitting and talking with her, being really blown away by that level of, and I don't want to just call it maturity, like it's wisdom. It's again that stuff of, just because I've been hurt doesn't mean I should go around hurting people. She understood what had happened to her. She had resolved it in some way that allowed her to be loving and caring in her expression in life. And for me, as someone who had you know, a part of the trauma that she had by being removed and then being placed into a non-Indigenous family. So it was, complete bewilderment and a sense of feeling lost when I was raised in Sydney. That she was able to show me that there was a way that you could resolve that within yourself. She had done it, so therefore my belief was I could do it. And it's that stuff for me about understanding I can't change the history. I can't change what happened to me. I can only change the emotional response I have to it. And then resolving that emotional response, whatever it is, to be able to walk a path that is a healthy one. So I always look for the silver lining. What's going on? What's the lesson here for me? What is my role? How do I hold myself and conduct myself? I learned that. I learned that from both women, but more so from Maxine, because she just had these incredible traumas happen to her, and she was still a beautiful, loving woman. And I admired that. And then I wanted to be like her. I didn't want to be angry. I didn't want to carry that trauma, because we now know that with epigenetics that trauma gets carried on and passed on to your children.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
have we talk a lot in Australia about the intergenerational trauma of
Mm-hmm.
First Nations people. I have two children. For me, I was really clear that the trauma in my family line was stopping with me. And I didn't want to pass that trauma on to my children. I probably did, but in terms of how I related to my children, and how I was aware of my own behaviors at times. So being really scared when they were out of my sight, being really scared that someone was going to take them, being really scared that something awful was going to happen to them. I used to catch myself in those moments. And particularly with my son, who was my firstborn, as he started to get older and he wanted to start going out by himself and things like that, like the sheer panic for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, is this response appropriate for him right now? He's he's a big boy. He's over 6 foot, and he was sensible. He was a peacekeeper. He was a bit of a warrior. He was a bit of a leader with his group of friends, and I knew he would be safe. It was just those emotions for me that just would get a bit chaotic in my thinking, that something would happen to him and he'd be taken. Um, it might happen. It probably wouldn't happen. So I used to talk to him about it, and he was great in being able to allow me to have faith in who he was and who his friends were, that when they go out they would take care of each other and look out for each other. So I started to have to shift my emotions around it. It was different when my daughter was born and as she was growing up. I just kind of I saw her and I saw myself in her.
That's
And
beautiful.
whilst my son was, a great learning in my emotions around, being taken and growing up with that. For my daughter, when she was born, it was different because she was female, and I thought, oh wow, what would be her life experience if she had been taken? And then at 3 years of age, I looked at her and I was like, what is her worldview? What does she know right now? Imagine her being, sent to live in Russia. It's a completely different language. It's a completely different culture, and it was a healing for me to be able to put the love into both my children, um, to to try and counteract emotionally what was going on for me. So it was a good experience, and even through my little idiosyncratic behaviors, sometimes both my kids are really good at just cajoling me out of it sometimes. And now that they're both adults, my daughter's about to turn 21 and my son's 26, and he's a police officer. He's very much the protector, which I'm incredibly grateful for.
Wow, Susan, these were some amazing, amazing lessons. So, so important and so deep and so touching. Thank you.
Pleasure. I guess there's
Do you?
there's some other things that I'd like to say,
Yes,
which is
please do.
in relation to us as being First Nations people in this country and the oldest living culture on the planet, that when we look at what's going on globally and how we treat the planet and how we treat each other as human beings and different races as well, I think that one of the things that we say is, and a lot of other people around the world, that First Nations people, that Indigenous peoples globally have the lessons and the knowledge and the ancient practices that can save the planet. And if people don't listen to who we are as Indigenous peoples, then we will continue to live on this planet in the way that we do, and we're simply destroying it. So for us here in Australia, there is starting to be a groundswell, particularly after at the beginning of the year. We had the droughts and then we had the fires and then we had the floods, and a lot of people were turning to our land management practices and our water management practices, and understanding that what was superimposed here was the understanding of four seasons, when for a lot of our continent, there's six, if not even more, like 8 seasons that are the traditional seasons of this continent. So even though we had colonization, people are looking to the original practices on this planet, which I think is a good thing. It's very slow to happen, but I think globally, the more that we listen and embrace First Nations, Indigenous Indigenous cultural practices, that's when we'll start to see a shift in living sustainably on this planet, because we've only got one planet, and I know that there's some of those people who are trying to find life on other planets and rockets and
Let's not go there.
I know, it's like crazy, right?
Yeah,
But we need to do this better, and First Nations people will lead the way.
I love that you said that, because for me, it's living with nature that we have to relearn and learn through the ones that knew how to do it and know how to do it. This is the only way we can save the planet, if we still can.
Yeah.
And I love that you're saying this. It's such an important point of learning from the elderly, which we are in a way trying to do with this podcast. learning through those who came before us.
Yeah.
And we are so arrogant nowadays and think that we can do better, and we are more clever and intelligent and have all this, I don't know,
the technology and
science
the
and
innovation,
technology, but it's time we
science, all of that.
embrace. I always
Yeah,
call for embracing both, for learning how to take the best of all worlds. I think this is the only way we can survive as a
correct.
planet.
Yeah, because we have this belief, which I call the triangular balance. So it's about trying to find the balance between the human world, the physical world, the environment, and the sacred world.
Yes.
So when we have all three in balance, then we will live differently on the planet. And with technology, with the industrial revolution, with money, we've got things out of balance, and we're focusing and valuing the wrong things. And we think that there's this infinite resources on the planet, and we're simply destroying the planet. So it's about how we can shift our perspective, and the things that we say in Australia is put the Indigenous lens over the business that we're doing, put the Indigenous lens over the economy, because it's not just about money. Like we need to care for ourselves as human beings living on the planet. We need to change our behaviours and practices so we can be more sustainable. And if we only can open our ears to the messages of elders and older people who have ancient knowledge, when that happens, we will do things differently.
Yes. When we relearn to live with nature.
Yeah.
And accept we're not more intelligent than it.
And with the plants and the animals and all the creatures, all the other species, they are our relatives. And we kill them without thinking, and we bulldoze huge tracts of land without understanding that we're actually harming ourselves in the process.
Yep. Susan, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Let me recap. I'd like to recap what we've learned from both Mama Jen and Mama Maxine. We learned that in relationship, you have to recognize when it's not about you, but about them, to not internalize the negative things other people do to you. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
That's good so far.
What I loved was the point to sometimes just walk away from a situation that doesn't work. I think that's a very important one, that we often forget that we have that choice as well. And then we have that you can't change history, but you can change your emotional response to it. And you can resolve your history, and you can walk your new path with beauty and love, which we'll learn from Mama Maxine. And to resolve our trauma, I think this is very, very important.
Yep, you got it.
Okay. Susan, thank you so much for this fantastic conversation.
Pleasure. That was fun.
Oh, yes, it was fantastic. I think I'm excited for my listeners to learn from you and to learn about this topic. And I love opening eyes. Let's say here's to saving the planet together.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Susan, so much.
Pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Yes.
Take care.
If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyoumama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week. subscribe, and tell your friends.